Jack Harrison had lived his whole life in the dust of Halden's outer colony. He was not a soldier, and he had never worn the polished armor of the Queen's Guard. He was a miner, a man who had worked with dirt under his nails and sweat on his back. He was strong in a quiet way, and he carried the look of someone who had spent many years under a hard sun. Jack wanted nothing more than to raise his two boys in peace and see them grow in a world free of fear, but peace was slipping away. Rumors had come from the Central Worlds. Queen Eleanor was reaching for more power than ever before. She demanded loyalty from every colony, demanded taxes and resources, and demanded that all men answer the call of her crown. Those who resisted were marked as rebels. It did not matter if they wanted only to live quiet lives. In her eyes, they stood against her. Many remembered the old stories of what happened when men were cornered, and many remembered the saying whispered in fear and respect, "Never chase humans." But in her pride, the Queen believed those words were weak myths. Ethan Brooks was one of Jack's closest friends. Ethan was a father too, though the war had already taken his wife and daughter from him. He was not as quiet as Jack. He had a fire in his voice that made people listen to him. He could stand on a worn table in a tavern and speak to a room of exhausted miners and somehow give them hope again. He never asked for that role, but when others lost the strength to keep going, Ethan spoke, and they found it. Samuel Carter was younger than both Jack and Ethan. He was an engineer who had loved machines since he was a boy. Where others saw only broken ships or forgotten mining rigs, he saw possibilities. He could take the most useless scrap and shape it into something that flew, fired, or saved a life. He smiled less than most, but when he talked about the machines he built, his words carried a secret pride. One evening, all three men met at the ridge where the mines dropped into hollow ground. Lights from the Queen's ships glowed in the distant sky. They had come. Jack stood with his arms crossed, staring at the controlled light of the patrols. The low hum of their engines carried across the valley. It was not difficult to see what was coming. "They will not stop at demands," Jack said. His voice was steady, but the weight of it was clear. "When we refuse, they will take. When we run, they will follow. They have declared us enemies already." Ethan clenched his jaw. His hands were scarred from long work, but he carried his rifle with care. "The Queen thinks her power is enough to break us. She does not know that when men are hunted, when we are chased like animals, something changes. We become hunters too." Samuel looked out over the sky, where the glow of the patrols swept like watchful eyes. He adjusted the strap of his worn kit bag. "If they chase us into these mines, they will pay for every step. We know these tunnels better than they do. We will make them regret it." The three men stood in the silence of that moment and did not need to say more. Behind them was home. Behind them were families who trusted them to stand firm. In front of them was the might of a queen who thought herself above all history. She had broken the oldest law without fear or hesitation, and soon all would see why that law had been written in every heart across the colonies. Jack turned back to the camp and felt the quiet rage of his people rising. Farmers and miners, broken fathers, hungry sons, women who refused to be cast aside. They were not soldiers, and they were not trained, but already they were gathering with weapons of steel, with tools turned into knives, with cargo ships stripped into gunboats. Ethan raised his voice so that the people could hear it carry across the ridge. His words were strong, and his voice struck deep. "She has made this choice. We will not fall quietly. We will show her what it means when she breaks the old law. We will show her what men become when they are hunted. We will not be prey." In the distance, the Queen's fleet spread wider and brighter across the sky. The chase that should never have begun was now real, and with each heartbeat the fire inside the Outworld men grew stronger. The law was about to be written again, this time in iron and blood. Ethan Brooks woke before the morning light and walked through the small camp where their people had gathered. Men and women were sharpening tools, patching torn clothes, and fitting old parts onto their makeshift ships. The air smelled of smoke and metal. Children moved quietly, clinging to mothers who spoke in low voices. This was no longer a life of farming or mining. This was a camp preparing for war. Samuel Carter was bent over the broken frame of a cargo hauler. His hands were black with grease, but his eyes were steady. He had almost no working parts left, but he shaped what he had into weapons, strong enough to strike. What? When Ethan knelt beside him, Samuel gave a half smile. "One more ship ready today?" Samuel said. His voice was rough, but there was a trace of pride in his words. "It will not look like much, but it will fire when needed." Ethan nodded and put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. Every ship is worth 10 of theirs, when it is flown by someone who knows what he is fighting for. Jack Harrison came out from the mines carrying a rifle slung across his back. His eyes swept over the camp and over every tired face. He walked with the weight of a leader, even though he had never asked for such a role. People followed him with their eyes because he did not bend, and they needed that strength more than food or water. By noon, the warning came. Scout ran down from the high ridge, his chest heaving, his voice shaking with urgency. "Queen's patrols. They are coming this way, not in dozens, in hundreds. They think they have us trapped." The camp went silent for a moment. Mothers pulled their children behind the rocks. Men gripped weapons with hands that trembled. Then Jack raised his rifle and lifted it high. "They believe we will scatter," Jack said. His words were simple, but they carried deep into every heart. "They believe we will bow and beg. We will not. We will fight for our ground, and we will show them that men do not run when hunted." Ethan stood beside him and raised his voice stronger than the roar of the engines now rising in the sky. "They think we are prey. Today they learn we are not." The first wave of the Queen's forces came like a shadow, dark against the pale sky. The sound of their engines thundered across the valley. They arrived in tight lines, polished armor shining, their ships in formation. To the Crown, such a display meant fear and surrender. To the men of the Outworlds, it meant the challenge had begun. Samuel gave the signal to the hidden turrets he had built from old drills and steel pipes. The first blast shot from the mines and struck one of the Queen's crafts. Sparks burst across the sky. The valley shook with the shock of that first strike. The soldiers of the Queen fired back, their rifles spilling light across the ridge. But the miners knew every stone and every curve of the land. They hid in tunnels, they darted between rocks, and from every shadow they answered with fire of their own. Jack led a group through the narrow passages, striking from behind and vanishing again before the enemy could react. Ethan stood on the slope, rifle in hand, shouting orders that turned frightened laborers into fighters. Samuel's rebuilt haulers rose into the air, clumsy but deadly, spraying fire from weapons welded onto their sides. The Queen's patrols, certain of victory, found themselves torn apart by traps at every corner. Mines, buried in the ground, struck their advanced lines. Nets of steel cable closed down on their armored vehicles. All the while, the Outworld fighters pressed harder. It was not a polished army that broke the first wave. It was farmers with rusted rifles, mothers throwing fire from the high ridge. Young men who had never seen battle standing side by side with old men whose hands shook, but hearts did not. Every strike carried more fury because every strike came from people who had been told they were nothing. By nightfall, the Queen's patrols had broken. Fires burned in the fields where her forces had fallen. Cries of pain rose from wreckage twisted on the rocky ground. Outworld men and women stood bloodied and weary, but they stood. Jack looked over the valley, his chest rising with the hard rhythm of battle fought and won. He saw his people standing together, and he knew the Queen would not stop. This had only been the first blow. She would send more, and she would come with all her wrath. But tonight they had struck her, and word of this fight would spread. The oldest law had been broken, and now the chase had begun. In the silence that followed the smoke, the Outworld fighters knew they were no longer only survivors. They were the storm rising against a queen who thought she could command fear itself. The fire still smoldered in the broken fields when dawn came. Men and women worked together to carry their wounded into shelters carved into the stone. Smoke hung low, and the air was heavy with both pain and victory. Few had slept, yet the camp was alive with a strange strength. They had fought against the Queen's patrols and had not broken. For the first time, the people of Halden felt hope rise among them, though it burned alongside fear. Jack Harrison walked the ridge with a rifle on his shoulder. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were hard and steady. He looked down at the wreckage left by the Queen's soldiers. Engines burned in scattered heaps. Armor lay broken in the dirt. He took it all in, and understood that this was not an end, but only the beginning. Ethan Brooks joined him, carrying a torn coat over one arm, and a cracked rifle in his hand. His voice was quiet at first. "She will never forgive this, Jack. The Queen lost men here, and her pride is deeper than the oceans. If she chased us before, she will now hunt us with all her fury." Jack gave a slow nod. "Then let her come. We cannot run any farther. If this is where we stand, then this is where we fight." In the heart of the camp, Samuel Carter was already at work again. He dragged scorched metal out of the wreckage and studied it with the eyes of a man who saw more than junk. Children followed him, carrying small pieces while he sorted them into piles. To most eyes, it was nothing but broken scraps, but to Samuel, it was the sound of opportunity. He whispered to himself as he worked, shaping plans in his mind. Ethan knelt down beside Samuel and watched him repair a bent plate with fire and hammer. "We will need every machine you can give us," Ethan said. "She will not send patrols next time. She'll send more ships." Samuel did not look up. "Then our ships will not look pretty, but they will make a mark. I will take the broken, and I will make them dangerous." Word of the battle spread fast beyond Halden. Traders whispered of it in the markets of other colonies. Farmers passed the tale from one to another, and families lit fires at night. Speaking of men who had dared to stand against the crown, the queen sat on her throne at the core and heard these whispers. Every new story spread her shame further. She struck her hand against the arm of her throne and swore that she would burn Halden to ash for making a mockery of her law. By the third day, her greater fleets had begun to move. Thousands followed her command. Long lines of warships cut across the stars, shadows of polished steel moving toward the outworlds. She told her captains that the men of Halden were weak and broken. She told them that fire would sweep the rebellion away. None of her words carried doubt. Yet in the dark corner of every mind, the old story stirred once more, a warning older than her crown. Never chase humans. Back in the camp, plans were drawn in the dirt. Jack gathered the strongest fighters beside the quiet fire, while Ethan spoke to the crowd with steady words, turning fear into will. Mothers brought water, sons carried rifles, and daughters filled packs with food and stone. None of them believed they could rest again. All knew the chase was no longer a hunt, but a war. Samuel presented a rebuilt hauler, its sides scarred, but armed with hidden guns. When he showed how its belly opened with fire, the camp roared in awe. For the first time, they saw more than survival. They saw a weapon to strike back. Night came with silence across the valley. Families tried to sleep, though the ground trembled with distant thunder from ships gathering in the sky. Jack lay awake, staring upward, knowing that soon the true storm would fall. He thought of his children, of the lives they all wanted, and then he rose and walked through the camp once more. Everywhere he looked, in each tired face, he saw the same truth. They were ready. The queen had chosen to break the oldest law of all. She had chosen to chase men across the dark, and what had begun as a hunt was now a battle written in blood and fire. The law was stirring back to life, and it would not be forgotten again. The sky above Halden turned black with the arrival of the queen's fleet. Her warships covered the horizon like a storm without end. The sound of their engines was so deep that it shook the ground and rattled the walls of every shelter in the valley. Families held their children close, and even the bravest men felt the weight of fear pressing on their hearts. Yet no one ran. The people had chosen to fight, and they stood ready. Jack Harrison walked in front of the line of fighters. His boots were thick with dirt, and his shoulders were heavy from sleepless nights, but his presence gave strength. He looked into the faces of farmers, miners, sons and daughters holding rifles. He raised his voice so all could hear. They think victory is certain. They believe we will bend or break. Show them we are not prey. Show them we are hunters now. Ethan Brooks joined him on the ridge. He lifted his weapon high and shouted, "Do not forget what we fight for. Look at your children. Look at your homes. We stand for them. Fight harder than you ever thought possible." His words cut through the fear and filled the people with fire. Samuel Carter was already in the tunnels, guiding his machines into place. He barked orders to groups of young men who helped him set charges along the rocks. He checked each turret, each cannon patched together from broken tools, and reminded the boys not to waste a single shot. "Every strike counts," he told them. "Make them regret every step into our ground." When the Queen's ships opened fire, light tore the sky apart. The valley shook as explosions rang across the fields. Massive blasts hammered the stone walls, and dust rained down from the ridges. Yet the people of Halden did not scatter. From their tunnels and hidden paths, they struck back. The first wave of the Queen's soldiers pushed into the valley in lines of polished armor. They raised their banners and moved as one, certain of crushing victory. Then the ground beneath them erupted as Samuel's charges detonated. Fire swallowed their front lines. Smoke covered the valley and split their order into chaos. From the cliffs above, men and women rained gunfire down, forcing the Queen's soldiers to stumble and fall in panic. Jack leaped forward with his fighters, charging into the broken lines. He struck with a fury born of years of silent labor finally bursting free. Beside him, Ethan moved through the battlefield with fire in his eyes, rallying every group that faltered. He called names, shouted encouragement, and reminded them that they were stronger together. Samuel's rebuilt haulers rose from the hidden bays. Though patched and scarred, they roared into the air, spewing fire on the ships above. The Queen's warships fought back, their cannons burning the ground. But the Outworld pilots struck quick and hard, weaving through the fire before vanishing back into cover. The Queen's commanders pressed forward with more troops, but for every strike they made, the fighters of Halden answered. The tunnels twisted like veins beneath the battlefield, allowing small groups to appear behind enemy lines. Hunters who had once known only mining now moved like shadows, striking fast and vanishing before counterattacks could land. Their enemy tired, their enemy bled, and still the Outworlders grew more fierce. The valley became a storm of sound and fire. Smoke blackened the day. Screams echoed through stone, and the clash of steel and iron carried far into the night. The Queen's men fought with training, but the people of Halden fought with something deeper. They fought not to rule, not for power, but for survival and freedom. Strength filled every strike with meaning. By midnight, the field was littered with wreckage from both sides. Flames licked across broken ships, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Yet Jack stood tall on the ridge, his rifle raised, his body bloodied, but unbroken. Behind him, Ethan gathered the survivors and gave them courage when their strength began to fail. Samuel kept his machines alive through sheer will, repairing by firelight so they could strike again before dawn. The Queen had thrown her vast fleet into battle, and still had not broken their spirit. She had expected fear and retreat. Instead, she faced hunters who would never stop. In her pride, she had broken the oldest law, and with every hour, it grew clear to her commanders that she had unleashed something stronger than all her armies. That night, while flames burned across the valley, the people of Halden whispered to one another through smoke and ash. They whispered that victory was possible. They whispered that the law was on their side. Never chase humans, they said, because once the chase begins, nothing can stop them from rising. The fires of battle still raged across the broken valley when the first red light of morning touched the sky, though the ground was covered with ash, broken steel, and torn banners. The once quiet home of Halden had become a graveyard of machines and men. Yet in the smoke and ruin, the people still stood. They were battered, tired, and marked by loss, but their eyes held a power that even the Queen's armies could not erase. Jack Harrison walked slowly among the wounded, his rifle heavy at his side. Every step he took carried both sorrow and strength. He stopped to help a young fighter who could barely rise, lifting him and speaking in a steady voice. "You are alive, and that means we still fight." The boy nodded and gripped Jack's hand tightly. Moments like this bound their people together stronger than chains. Ethan Brooks climbed onto a broken hauler so his voice could reach everyone who remained. His clothes were torn and his arms were covered in cuts, yet he stood as if taller than the wreckage surrounding him. He spoke with all the fire in his chest. "Look at what we have done. They came with fleets that blotted out the sky. They came with soldiers trained to crush us. And where are they now? Broken in the dust of our home. Remember this, we are not prey, and never again shall we be treated as such." The people raised their weapons in answer, their voices lifting together in ragged cries of pride. Samuel Carter worked with hands that shook from exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. He bent over a line of destroyed ships and tore pieces free, already thinking of what new machines he could shape by night. Sweat rolled down his brow as he spoke softly to himself. There must always be another way to strike. There must always be one more fight in us. Even children helped him, passing along tools or carrying parts, their eyes wide with determination. Everyone had become part of the defense now. Far above, the Queen sat in her gold-lined chamber aboard her flagship, staring at the reports brought by her captains. The pride she had once carried now burned like fire inside her. Her fleets had been scattered. Her patrols, once praised as unbreakable, had fallen to miners and farmers. Each failed report was like a stone weighing down her crown. She gripped the arm of her throne until her knuckles turned white. She could not understand how men of dust and rock had done what empires could not. Yet deep within her heart, beneath the anger, a spark of fear began to grow. She thought of the stories she had scorned. She thought of that law carried in whispers across the galaxies. Never chase humans. She had broken it openly, believing her power greater than any old tale. Now her armies were in ruins, her crown weakened, and her name spoken in shame even by her own advisors. Back on the ground, Jack gathered Ethan and Samuel beside the dying fire at the edge of camp. The three men stared into the smoke and the ember glow, each knowing what the coming days held. Jack spoke first, his voice steady despite the weight it carried. This war is not over. She will come again. She cannot bear to accept defeat. We have shown her what happens when men are hunted. She now knows what every ruler before her feared, and so long as we stand, she will never break us. Ethan nodded, looking across the camp where children slept beside their mothers with rifles close at hand. She thought we would run into the shadows. Instead, we rose in the light. That truth will spread farther than her crown can reach. Samuel touched the steel scraps piled around him and whispered, "We will rise again and again, no matter how many times she strikes." The silence that followed was heavy but not without hope. Fire still burned in the valley, yet in those flames a new strength lived. These people had been chased, but in that chase they had found their true power. Across distant worlds, the tale of Halden spread. Traders, farmers, and wanderers spoke of the men who refused to bow. They spoke of the Queen who had broken the oldest law and paid dearly. From one corner of the stars to the next, rulers repeated the warning with new fear in their voices. Never chase humans. The law was remembered again, not as myth, but as living truth, written in steel, blood, and courage. And in the hearts of the people of Halden, the law burned unshakable, for they had proven its meaning with their own hands. They had been chased, and in the chase, they had become the storm.